Welcome, dear listener, wherever you are tonight, wrapped in quiet beneath soft blankets, or simply drifting in stillness. I'm so glad you've joined us. Let the noise of the day fall behind. No more rushing, no more screens, just breath and story. Tonight, we return to the cold stone halls of the medieval court, a place where power whispered louder than truth, where silence was survival, and disobedience, even the quiet kind, came with a price. This is not a tale of heroes, but of those who bowed and those who didn't, and what happened next. So settle in, let your thoughts drift, and follow me into the slow, shadowed world of justice and fear. This is the brutal price of disobedience in the medieval court. It is said that in the ancient court of Narration, no one spoke above a murmur, not because they feared interruption, but because they feared being heard. The walls had long memories, they claimed. The tapestries listened. Even the stones beneath their feet seemed to shift slightly when a name was uttered too boldly. It wasn't law that kept mouths shut, not written law anyway. It was something far older, far deeper. A hush that had settled over the royal halls centuries ago and had never lifted. There was a long corridor that led to the throne room. It was lined with arches of cracked marble and tall, narrow windows that let in shafts of dust instead of light. Courtiers called it the spine, not because of its shape, which was straight and proper, but because walking down it always made one feel as though a cold finger had trailed along the base of the neck. Whispers were common here, though no one admitted to making them. Visitors claimed to hear names spoken behind their backs, their own names, even when the hall was empty. Servants walked in pairs, and never after sunset. At the end of the spine sat the throne. Not a grand thing, not golden or tall. It was made of ancient oak, blackened with oil and age. Its back was high, its seat wide, but what truly made it feared was what lay beneath it. Stone, a flat gray slab carved directly into the floor. The surface was etched with spiral forgotten script, so shallow it was almost invisible. Only those who knelt close could see it, and most who did were not seen again. No one knew who carved it. No one knew what it said. The kings never acknowledged it, and yet none dared move the throne away from it. It was called the Whisper, not a name spoken aloud, but known, felt. It was said the Whisper had been placed there in the days before the first king, before the castle had its name, before law, before coin, before the great banners of the North had ever flown. The Whisper was older than obedience, but it demanded it all the same. The current king, Valentine the Grey, was not known for violence. He did not shout. He did not lash out. He had never raised a hand in fury. Yet his court was the most silent, the most orderly, the most deathly still in all the kingdoms. He sat upon that old throne like it was an extension of himself. His robes always the color of ash. His fingers always wrapped around a single ivory ring that had belonged to his father, and his eyes, pale and unreadable, seemed always to be looking slightly above the heads of those who knelt before him. Disobedience in this court did not need to be punished loudly. It was punished by absence. You would notice someone had not appeared for supper, that their quarters had been reassigned, that their name was missing from the roster of chamber duties. No screams, no trial, only silence, and those who remained learned to obey more deeply because of it. One such soul was Marchin, a minor scribe who had spent 20 years in the shadows of courtly life. He copied decrees, traced maps, rewrote ceremonial texts, and made sure every title was spelled correctly. He was quiet, small, and entirely forgettable, which in Varellan was perhaps the safest form of survival. But Marchin had once seen something he wasn't meant to. It had been late, too late. He had returned to the archive chamber to retrieve a scroll misfiled by a new assistant. The halls were dim, torches low. The whisper of his own feet on the stone echoed more than he liked. As he rounded the corner near the spine, he heard it. Not footsteps, not voices. A sound beneath sound. A murmur, layered and circular, as though a dozen voices were speaking over each other, but all in the same rhythm. He froze. The corridor ahead was empty. The air was still, but the noise was coming from beneath the throne. He did not run. He did not investigate. He stood there, heart pounding, until it stopped. The next morning, Marchin reported a mild fever. He stayed in his quarters for 2 days. On the third day, a knock came at his door. A page. No letter. Just a message. His Grace requests your presence. Marchin dressed slowly. He thought of running, of hiding. But where could one run when the walls themselves remembered? He walked the spine slowly, deliberately. And when he knelt before the throne, he kept his eyes on the king's boots. King Valentine said only one thing. Did you hear it? Marchin hesitated. That pause, that single moment of indecision, was enough. He was dismissed with a nod. He returned to his duties the next day. But he spoke less. He slept less. And within a month, he was gone. No announcement. No ceremony. A new scribe took his place. The spiral beneath the throne remained. And those who worked nearby claimed the whisper had grown louder. It was this quiet vanishing and soft, creeping fear left behind that gave rise to a new understanding in the court. Disobedience did not begin with shouting. It began with listening. And as we follow the path of obedience and its price deeper into the heart of this court, we turn now to those ancient rules, ones written in blood and dust, so old and strange they no longer protected anyone, only punished. The rules of Varellan's court were never recited aloud. They were not displayed in stone, nor carved in wood, nor kept in any official volume bound by leather and chain. There was no ceremony for their reading, no scribes to speak them aloud during judgment. They simply existed, not as guidance, but as threats. And though no one ever said them, everyone knew them. They were the kind of rules that arrived in silences, in the way a room would pause when someone stood too quickly, in how the king's head would tilt slightly if a subject took a breath before speaking, in how a servant's eyes would widen when someone laughed at the wrong moment. These were not laws of justice or governance. These were rituals of control, customs so old their original meanings have been lost, buried under centuries of obedience, and they were always enforced. Old courtiers, the ones who had survived multiple kings, would sometimes whisper of a time when laws had been spoken. They would recall, only after too much wine and never during daylight, the Book of Dust, a tome bound in dark bark-like leather, said to be kept under lock in the Shadow Archive. It was not listed in the royal inventory. No one claimed to have seen it, and yet everyone agreed that it existed. The Book of Dust was said to hold the first laws of obedience, written before there was a throne, before there were kings, before there was even a Varellan. It had been penned, they said, by those who first walked the stone corridors of the palace. Not rulers, but watchers. Not judges, but listeners. The book's script was rumored to be so old it could not be read aloud without consequence. The tongue it was written in was dead, and speaking its phrases would raise memories best left buried. But the rules themselves, whether from a book or older still, lived on. Some were strange. You were never to turn your back to the western wall of the Great Hall. You were never to enter the Rose Garden before the sixth bell. You were never to place your left hand on your chest when bowing, only the right. And you were never to look directly at the king's ring. No one knew why. No one asked, because those who asked were usually the ones who vanished. There had been a lady once, Lady Fenwin, who had returned from a pilgrimage to the borderlands. She was sharp-witted, quick of tongue, and had been favored in court for her stories of foreign markets and strange spices. But one day, during a lull in court business, she asked why the bell tower no longer rang at dawn. A pause followed. The king said nothing. Neither did his advisors. Lady Fenwin smiled, unaware. The next week, her estate was reassigned. By the next moon, her name was no longer listed in the registry. No one ever said she had disobeyed. No one punished her publicly. But her question, just a question, was enough. In Varellan, curiosity was the first form of disobedience. The rules were meant to be followed without understanding. That was their point. The more meaningless they seemed, the more powerful they became. For to obey something senseless, something contradictory, something cruel, was to demonstrate true loyalty. And in a court that thrived on fear, loyalty was measured in silence, not sincerity. Even the punishments had become part of the unspoken code. There were no dungeons in Varellan, no public stocks, no gallows, Disobedience was not punished with spectacle. It was punished with absence. A servant who dropped a goblet during a feast might find his room emptied the next day. A page who repeated a joke heard in the kitchen might be reassigned to the southern stables, never to return. A knight who failed to bow deep enough might ride out with patrol and never come back. The court learned. They always learned. And in learning, they forgot. They forgot the reasons behind the rules. They forgot who had made them. They forgot the names of those who had vanished. And in time, they forgot that obedience was ever a choice. There was an archivist once, Mern Halwick, who dared to search for the origins of a rule. Just one rule. He found a scroll, older than most bricks in the Western Tower, written in rust-colored ink. It referenced something called the Trial of Silence, a ritual meant to test the loyalty of those who questioned orders. Mern did not understand it. The language was fragmented, the references cryptic, but he made the mistake of mentioning it to his apprentice. By morning, the scroll was gone. So was Mern. The apprentice never spoke again. Some said the Book of Dust had been opened. Others said it had merely watched. But none asked further, because that, too, would be a form of disobedience. The court continued on. People bowed. People knelt. People smiled at the right moments. But none of them felt safe. Not truly, because to live in Varellan's court was to walk a narrow bridge of ash, knowing that a single misstep, even an innocent one, could cost you not just your life, but your place in memory. No monuments would be carved. No song sung. You would simply stop existing. And the court would go on as if you had never been. It is in this silence, this enforced amnesia, that we find the next layer of dread. The constant awareness that you were being watched. That every movement, every word, every breath was recorded not by scrolls or scribes, but by the very walls themselves. Let us now walk into the court of eyes, not ears, where seeing was everything, and hearing could be fatal. In Varellan, sound had long been deemed dangerous, not because it betrayed secrets of the wind, but because it stirred memory, and memory, the court had decided, was treasonous. Words, once spoken, could be remembered. Remembered words could be repeated, and repetition created stories. Stories encouraged interpretation, and interpretation, that led to thought, and thought led to disobedience. Thus, in time, the court stopped listening altogether, not just to the voices of its people, but to everything that could not be seen. In this way, it evolved from a palace of whispers to something colder, stiffer, a living monument to observation without understanding. They called it, though never aloud, the court of eyes, not ears. It wasn't a literal court, not a specific room or hallway. It was an idea that crept into every corner of the palace, like frost on stone. It meant that every interaction was to be conducted with the eyes alone. Every intention, every warning, every lesson, all conveyed in the subtle choreography of a glance. A nod could carry the weight of sentence. A blink could erase suspicion. Averted eyes meant guilt. Direct stares were aggression. Looking too long was challenge. Looking away too fast was fear. There was a tempo to it all, a silent rhythm only the practice survived. Guards did not speak when they changed shifts. They stood in silence and passed their gaze like a torch. Chambermaids would signal each other with twitches of the eyebrow, a crooked finger, the tilt of the candle wick, a pause when pouring wine. These were the signs one learned if they wanted to last more than a month within the palace walls. For new servants, survival was a matter of adaptation. Many didn't. There was a girl once, Elena, sent from the eastern hills, born to a minor noble who had traded her service in exchange for leniency in taxation. She arrived with soft shoes and softer eyes, having been trained in etiquette but not in the coded silence of the inner court. On her second week, she asked another servant a question, aloud, just a simple question, about when the queen's robes were to be aired for the Festival of Thorns. The girl she asked, an older linen maid named Marie, did not reply, did not even blink. Her face was the picture of waxen calm. But that evening, Elena's bunk was empty, her pillow removed, her name erased from the duty slate. Marie never spoke again, not even in the servant quarters. The silence grew deeper, To survive in the court of eyes, one had to become a mirror, reflecting only what others showed, never revealing anything original. Individuality was dangerous, expression fatal. Obedience was not just about doing the right thing. It was about appearing to do it without question, without delay, without a flicker of doubt. And so, people trained themselves to still their faces. They practiced in mirrors, in pools, in polished armor. Courtiers and servants alike would spend hours rehearsing reactions, grief, joy, indignation, all carefully balanced and pre-approved by custom. Even mourning became ritualized into a glance downward, held for precisely 4 breaths, no more. The king, of course, was a model of this discipline. Valentine the Grey did not speak unless a verdict was to be delivered. His eyes were gray too, like his name, like the sky before snow, and yet they held a weight more crushing than any shouted decree. It was said that to be looked upon by the king was a kind of judgment in itself. That one glance could strip the soul of its illusions, that the coldness in his stare had once stopped a man's heart. No physician ever confirmed that last claim, but neither did they deny it. One story, half folklore, half fear truth, was that of Sir Kellyan, a knight of foreign birth who had once served as a bodyguard of the prince during a journey to the borderlands. Tall, proud, and trained in the blunter arts of warfare, Sir Kellyan had not been schooled in the customs of courtly glancing. On his return, he was granted audience with the king to report on the safety of a mission. When Valentine looked up from his throne, Sir Kellyan did not bow his eyes. He met the gaze, held it. Witnesses say the court froze. Even the torches flickered as though afraid. The king said nothing. Neither did Sir Kellyan. But by nightfall, the knight had departed the palace, stripped of insignia and title. A week later, he was found face down in the river behind the barracks, his sword still sheathed. Some claimed it was a warning. Others said it was mercy. But all agreed he had looked too long. What made the court of eyes so terrified was not just its silence, but its unpredictability. No one ever knew exactly which glance might be misread, which twitch of an eyelid might be mistaken for sarcasm, which narrowing of the brow might be deemed insolence. Everyone walked a tightrope of self-policing over a chasm of assumptions. There were, of course, those who learned to manipulate the system. Some courtiers rose in favor not by what they did, but by what they were seen to do or not do. A sigh, well-timed, could imply loyalty. A steady gaze during a moment of tension could suggest bravery. A shared glance across a feast table might win allies, or declare enemies. But even they, the clever ones, were not safe, because the court changed its mind often, and when the meaning of a look could shift overnight, survival became a matter not of cleverness, but of luck. No one was more aware of this than Thorn, the palace's master of lamps. He had held his position for 20 years, an unusually long tenure for any servant, and was considered a model of silent devotion. He never made mistakes. He never frowned. His eyes were always properly downcast. His gait was soundless, his work flawless. And yet, one morning, the eastern corridor remained unlit. The torches had not been trimmed. The wax bowls were untouched. And Thorn was gone. No note, no replacement, just darkness. It is said that another had watched him, a rival, perhaps, and had interpreted the brief upward lift of Thorn's left eyebrow during a court feast as disapproval. That was all it took. For in Varellan, you didn't need to speak to disobey. You only needed to be seen not believing. And so the court turned ever more inward. Mirrors were removed. Windows darkened. The palace no longer reflected light or sound or sense. It became a place of shadows, not cast by flame, but by suspicion. And in this hush, where every glance might be your last, we turn next to a tale even more dangerous than the glances themselves. The punishment that came not from what you said or showed, but from what you failed to do. Let us step now into the cold, vanishing moment known forever as the unspoken offense, a silence so dangerous, even breath could betray you. To understand the full terror of Varellan's court, one must come to terms with simple truth. Disobedience did not always require action. In many cases, it required a precise opposite, a hesitation, a pause, a failure to act with the speed, deference, or expression expected. In the great hush of the palace, where the language of glances reigned and ritual ruled all things, there was one particular form of disobedience more feared than any insult or insulted word: the unspoken offense. It could happen to anyone, noble, servant, advisor, knight. It was not tied to title or station. In fact, it was most common among those who tried their best to be invisible. For the unspoken offense was not committed by what one said or even did, but by what one did not say or did not do when the court expected it. The expectation was the law, the moment was the verdict, and the punishment, swift and nearly always unspoken, was disappearance. No trial, no confrontation, just a quiet rearrangement of space. One morning, a particular chair at the banquet table would be gone. A picture would no longer be needed. A uniform would hang, clean but ownerless, in the corridor outside the kitchen. And those who remained would know, instinctively, deeply, that something had been done wrong and that the palace had noticed. The tale most often whispered in this regard was that of Edric the Pale, a steward of great precision and near paralyzing timidity. Edric had survived 3 winters in the inner palace, a feat for someone with no title or land. He had been responsible for the schedules of minor ceremonies, tea arrangements, ink deliveries, sunshade adjustments, and cushion rotations. It was a quiet job, the kind that required invisibility, not opinion, perfection, not pride. One morning, during the seasonal court petitions, an event where villagers were allowed once a year to enter the outer hall and request aid, Edric was instructed to adjust the king's velvet footrest. A simple task. The king did not speak the order, of course. He simply flicked a finger. Edric moved to obey. But for 1 second, 1 heartbeat, he paused. The court did not gasp. That would have broken custom. No one moved. No one even looked at him. But that single beat, that breath of hesitation, was enough. It was noticed. The adjustment was made. The session continued. The villagers departed. Edric completed the day's duties without incident, but he was not seen at supper. By sunrise, his bed was gone. The footrest, oddly enough, was not used again. The unspoken offense became the most feared of all the silent rules. For unlike clear orders or visible laws, this crime existed in the unknown expectation. The unwritten pressure to act, speak, react, or defer exactly as imagined and often without warning. And because it was unspoken, one could never be quite sure what the crime had been. Those who vanished did so without explanation, and those who remained were left in a state of permanent tension. They learned to anticipate the king's gestures before they came. They trained their bodies to move reflexively, their eyes to follow shadows, their steps to halt when nothing moved. It created a court not of loyalty or grace, but of trained panic, a ballet of fear, where every wrong step went unrehearsed, and every punishment was a closing curtain no one clapped for. There were those who tried to test its limits. Saria, a young noblewoman of poetic flair and dangerous imagination, once attempted a smile after being complimented by the queen. Just a soft curl of the lips, nothing too bold. But in the quiet that followed, she realized no one else had. Not the ladies-in-waiting, not the scribes, not even the queen. That night, Saria walked the rose courtyard 3 times, whispering prayers to the old gods. By dawn, she was gone. Her absence was not noted, her belongings reassigned. A new noble arrived a week later to sit in her place, and no one said her name again. These disappearances were not treated as punishments. No, that would imply guilt. They were treated instead like symptoms of a grand disease. The sickness of forgetting one's place, one's rhythm, one's silence. The courtiers began to view life in the palace as a test not of skill, but of calibration. To survive, you had to constantly measure your soul against the invisible weight of expectation. And yet, even this was not always enough. There came a day when the king himself shifted in his chair, and no one noticed. A day when he raised a hand toward the firelight, and the fire was not stoked. No one knew why the signal had been missed. Perhaps it had been too subtle. Perhaps those closest had assumed it was not meant for them. Or perhaps, and this was the most whispered theory of all, perhaps the king had meant nothing, and simply watched to see who would fail. By the next moon, the keeper of the hearts had vanished. so had 2 musicians a page and a guard whose shift included the outer hall. No one knew which of them had failed, or whether all had. Their faces were gone from the painted wall scrolls. Their meals no longer tallied. And the court learned, again, the lesson that not knowing was not safety. It was part of the design. Because in the palace of Arellan, justice was not about what one did. It was about what was seen or not seen to be done. And guilt had no defense, only timing. This made life in the palace unbearable for those who still believed in fairness. Those who asked, even silently, how one might serve without knowing the rules. But to ask was to fall. And so they remained silent and moved carefully and became shadows of themselves. It is in this slow erosion, this grinding down of will and voice, that we find the next moment of dread. A tale passed from page to page, whispered across dusty shelves and ink-stained ledgers. The story of the chamberlain who coughed. A man who committed no crime, spoke no word, but whose single breath of illness was enough to end a career, a life, and a memory. Let us now walk into that faint echo of a man and learn what it meant to make a sound when sound had long since been outlawed. In the court of Arellan, silence was not merely preferred. It was required. It had grown like ivy over stone, curling through customs, habits, and rituals until it became indistinguishable from the palace itself. To speak was dangerous. To shout was treason. And to make a sound without cause, any sound, was an invitation to vanish, which is why the tale of Chamberlain Alric, remembered only in the softest corners of the court's memory, still lingers like dust in the breathless corners of the East Wing. Alric had served the palace for longer than many courtiers had been alive. He had no noble blood, no land to his name, but what he lacked in pedigree, he made up for in posture. Tall, thin, perpetually bowed just enough to appear deferent without seeming broken, Alric was the ideal court functionary. He knew the proper order of greetings. He knew which tapestries were to be replaced for which festivals. He knew the names of the king's dogs, even the ones long dead. He knew how many paces it took to walk from the throne room to the chamber of minor grievances. And most importantly, he knew how to remain utterly and completely silent. He had not spoken in the presence of the king in over 30 years. And not because he was forbidden, but because over time, he had simply become part of the background, as natural and unnoticed as the flicker of the sconces or the creak of the floorboards. He was trusted precisely because he was never noticed. But one day, in the early frost of spring, Alric made a sound. It happened during the ceremony of reaffirmation, a yearly tradition in which the king sat upon the whisper throne, while the court reenacted their vows of service. No one knew exactly when the tradition had started. Some said it predated the crown itself. Others claimed it had been created by Valentine, the Grey's grandfather, to assert dominance over the minor houses. Regardless, the ritual was followed precisely, with each courtier stepping forward, kneeling, and placing a hand to heart, right hand only, never left, before rising, stepping back, and bowing. Alric's role was simple. He stood at the side of the king's dais, holding a velvet-covered staff with a royal crest, indicating the order in which the nobles approached. He did not speak. He did not move unless signaled. He did not blink when the courtiers passed. He simply stood, as he always had, with his chin down and eyes calm. But this time, as the fifth noble, Lady Esmir of the Funmarches, completed her vow and turned, something changed. The hall was colder than usual. A wind had pushed through the southern archways earlier that morning, and the chill clung to the stone like memory. Alric's robes were heavy, but his breath was shallow. He had not been sleeping, and though he did not know it yet, a fever had begun to bloom beneath his skin. And so, as the ceremony continued, as another courtier stepped forward in silence reigned with all the weight of law, Alric, without warning, without intention, coughed. Just once. A dry, muffled, chest-rattling sound. It was not loud. It did not echo, but it existed, and that was enough. The court did not gasp. Gasping was too loud. Instead, the entire room shifted ever so slightly. A ripple passed through the air, not of noise, but of tension, like a single wrong note in a long, familiar song. The king did not move. His eyes, heavy-lidded and gray as always, did not flicker, but his fingers, resting on the armrest, curled once, then relaxed. The ceremony continued. Alric said nothing. He did not cough again. He remained in position until the end. He retired to his chambers as usual, washed, and ate a small portion of boiled barley. He even nodded to the steward of linens, as he always did on the last evening of the week. But by morning, his chambers were empty. The velvet staff was returned to the antechamber. The linens were folded, and the court did not ask what had happened, because they already knew. Alric had broken the silence, not with a shout, not with a cry, but with something far more dangerous, a reminder that the silence was fragile, and reminders in Varellon were intolerable. In the weeks that followed, no one replaced Alric. The position remained vacant. The staff leaned in the corner of the throne room, untouched. During ceremonies, the king himself signaled each courtier to approach. A flick of the hand, a tilt of the chin. No one acknowledged the change. But in the dark corridors near the east wing, servants whispered. They said they had seen Alric once. 2 weeks later, walking the edge of the palace grounds at dawn, his robes were gone. He wore common wool, a shade too thin for the season. He walked slowly, deliberately, as though counting each step. When he reached the shadow of the southern tower, he paused, looked back, and then was gone. Some say he was allowed to leave. Others claim he had been punished in a way worse than death, made invisible, forgotten, unmarked. A body with no name, a past with no presence. A living reminder that the court did not need executioners when silence could do the work more efficiently. And in the month that followed, the silence grew heavier. Servants walked more carefully. Advisors cleared their throats only behind closed doors. Feasts were quieter. The court, once a place of slow murmurs and nodding glances, became a place where even breath was monitored. It was the era of stillness. And from that stillness grew something stranger still. A new kind of obedience, measured not in words or deeds, but in the shapes the body could take. To kneel became a statement. To bow, a demand. To raise one's hand, a risk. And so the court began to reshape itself, molding its members into actors on a stage where posture alone told the story. In this new world, disobedience became physical. A slight lean, a premature rise, a flicker of resistance in the knee. Let us now step into that aching silence, where the body itself became language, and where the law of limbs and joints ruled more firmly than any spoken decree. We turn next to the law of knees and bows, a tale of aching backs, silent pride, and the quiet rebellion found in refusing to bend quite far enough. In the shifting silences of Varellon's court, as words vanished and glances sharpened, the human body became the final instrument through which loyalty could be measured. Gone were the proclamations of honor, the oaths spoken in crowded halls. The age of testimony had passed. Now, it was a man's posture that declared his submission, his knees that revealed his allegiance, and the angle of his bow that determined whether he would live to see another dusk. To serve the king was to master a new language, a grammar of the spine, a vocabulary of the limbs. There were no written guidelines, of course, just expectation, passed down like scent through the palace air. It was understood that the deeper the bow, the greater the respect. But how deep was deep enough? And when did reverence become suspicion? If one knelt too swiftly, did it seem rehearsed? If one hesitated, was it pride? No one could say for certain. And that was the cruelty of it. In Varellon, the law of knees and bows was unwritten, and therefore unanswerable. It was first noticed during the reign's second decade, when King Valentine began attending court less frequently. He would appear only during major observances, and on those days his arrival was silent. No trumpet, no herald, no great announcement of his name. Instead, he would enter the throne room to the side corridor, passing through an arch that remained dark and undecorated, a stretch of wall few dared even glance at. The moment he stepped into view, all movement ceased. Those standing knelt, those sitting bowed. The servants froze, often mid-task, pouring wine, carrying scrolls, balancing platters, and they remained frozen until he was seated. His hand settled upon the Whisperer Throne's armrest. One did not rise until he lifted his fingers. It became a test of endurance. Knees pressed against cold stone, backs bent at angles that trembled with the slow approach of age. Time no longer existed as hours or minutes in court. It existed in the span between kneeling and standing, sometimes seconds, often much longer. Many began preparing for it physically. Some slept on wooden boards to strengthen their posture. Others tied cloth around their waist to control their breathing. There were rumors of nobles hiring contortionists to coach them in flexibility. An entire generation of courtiers developed the same affliction, a slow, creeping stiffness in the lower back, brought on by years of ceremonial compliance. Yet even as they trained their bodies, fear remained, because one could never be entirely sure if their kneeling was correct. There had been a boy, Tomas of Glint, the son of a lesser baron, brought to court to learn the ways of noble service. Eager, bright-eyed, with knees too young to ache, he had knelt swiftly when the king appeared. Too swiftly, it seemed, for when he rose, the signal having been given, his face bore the hint of a smile. No one knew whether it was relief or pride, or merely the natural cheer of a youth who had passed his first courtly test. But it was enough. The king's eyes did not shift. His head did not move. But that evening, Tomas was called to the West Library to assist in moving a ledger, a common excuse, often the last one given. He never returned, and the baron, his father, never again bowed fully. His knees simply stopped bending. No one mentioned it. But a new table was placed in the rear of the hall, where the baron was allowed to sit during observances, and the king no longer looked in that direction. Others were less fortunate. A merchant once requested an audience to discuss trade routes. When his name was announced, he strode into the hall confidently, perhaps too confidently, and offered a deep, slow bow. His back curved perfectly, his eyes downcast, his arms respectfully extended. But when he rose, the room was already colder. Something in the timing had been off. He had taken too long, or not long enough, or perhaps his movement had simply drawn too much attention. He was escorted out before the end of the petition hour. His caravan, once thriving, was later seen broken on the outer road, its horses unbridled, its goods untouched. In time, the fear of Anil became more potent than the act itself. People began hesitating before kneeling, unsure if it was the right moment, the right posture, and that hesitation itself became suspicious. To bend too fast was to show eagerness, which might be interpreted as arrogance. To bend too slowly was defiance. To hold the bow too long, desperation. Too short, insolence. And so the court became a sea of trembling bodies, all bending with practiced caution, praying that their limbs did not betray them. The pain was real. Joints creaked, wrists swelled, ankles stiffened, but no one complained. To speak of the pain was to admit that one struggled, and to struggle was to suggest reluctance, and reluctance was the beginning of disobedience. Only one man ever dared to question the law of knees and bows directly. Ser Brandis, a veteran knight who had once served in the northern campaigns, whose leg had been shattered by an enemy's mace, and whose gait never quite recovered. He was granted audience one winter morning, a rare honor. When the king entered, Ser Brandis bowed, or tried to. His leg would not allow it. He dropped to one knee, steadied himself, and looked to the floor. But he did not collapse. He did not lower himself fully. When the king's hand finally rose, Ser Brandis struggled to his feet, then spoke quietly but clearly. "Forgive me, Majesty," he said. "I cannot bend further." It was a statement, not a plea. The room went still. The king did not reply. Ser Brandis was escorted to the barracks. His name was removed from the roster that same evening. But in the year that followed, the law shifted just slightly. A cushion was placed near the dais, a sign that perhaps the court was capable of adapting, or that the king's mercy could be disguised as foresight. Still, no one spoke of it. No one acknowledged that the law could bend, because acknowledging the law's flexibility meant it had rules. And if it had rules, then one might eventually question them. Better to continue bowing, knees bruised, backs aching, hearts silent. Better to suffer in shape than perish in protest. And so, the court remained bent, a palace of practiced pain. But even in this silence, there were those who found small ways to resist. In a finger that twitched before touching stone, or a head held a fraction too high. These rebellions did not go unnoticed, for the king watched all, and in the halls where knees cracked and backs trembled, the greatest fear was not collapse. It was standing too tall. And so we moved next to those who could not bend at all, not from pride, nor age, nor arrogance, but because something within them refused. We turned now to the servant who refused to kneel, and the terrible price of a spine held straight in the court of submission. The palace of Varellin was built on bending. Bending rules, bending backs, bending truth until only the curve remained. Straightness of thought, of word, of posture was unwelcome. So when one stood tall, visibly, unshaken by the weight of centuries, it did not go unnoticed. It went down in history. Quietly, like all things in Varellin, the tale of Elian, the servant who refused to kneel, was not recorded in scrolls. There are no portraits bearing his image, no family crest to trace. Yet his name lingered in the dust behind tapestries and the soot of unused chimneys, a whisper kept alive not by scribes, but by the fearful eyes of those who had watched it unfold. Elian had arrived at the palace unnoticed, as most do, when a dozen new arrivals brought in after fever had emptied the eastern dormitories. He was older than most new servants, perhaps 30, perhaps more, broad-shouldered, narrow-eyed, with the gait of someone who knew balance but had grown tired of proving it. He was placed in the linen ranks, tasked with folding robes and laying cushions at specific angles, 43 degrees from the table edge, precisely. His fingers were efficient, his silence appropriate. He never spoke out of turn. He responded to glances as trained. In all ways, he was ordinary, except for one thing. He did not kneel, not out of arrogance or physical limitation. His legs worked fine. He was seen bending to scrub floors, to lift crates, to sweep hearth ashes. But when the king passed, when others sank like stalks of wheat before the scythe, Elian remained standing, still, eyes downcast, shoulders relaxed. Silent, yes, but upright. At first, this was excused. He was new, perhaps untrained. The court allowed a margin of ignorance for the freshly arrived. But as weeks passed and the pattern held, murmurs began to form, silent of course, but present. Servants shifted away from him in corridors. They cleaned separate from him, walked slower behind him, spoke softer when near him. Even eye contact became rare. Elian noticed, but he did not change. He continued his work, folded the linens, balanced the robes, delivered scrolls, cleaned the tea handles with a cloth wrapped twice around his hand, as per custom. And when the king walked past, Elian stood, still, eyes to the floor, back unbowed. The courtiers did not understand it. In Varellin, rebellion usually came as hesitation, a glance, a tremor. This was boldness, a lack of bending, not a failure to bend. He was not resisting. He simply wasn't complying, and that terrified them, because the rules of Varellin's silence only worked when everyone agreed to play their part. Obedience had become architecture, and Elian was a pillar out of place. The first to confront him, subtly, was Steward Vels, a narrow man with a voice like withered parchment. Vels approached Elian late one night, while they restocked the candle drawers. "You don't kneel," he whispered, not accusing, not yet. "I do what is required," Elian replied. "It is required to kneel, to show reverence, yes. And you do not." "I show respect. I do not perform it." That was the end of the conversation. Vels reported the words to the Master of Shadows, a woman whose name no one spoke, who moved to the palace like a myth in human shape. Whether she delivered the message to the king is unknown, but something changed. The following week, Elian's tasks were changed. He was reassigned to throne maintenance, a subtle punishment disguised as promotion. He now had to polish the Whisper throne each morning and dust its cushions with powdered linen. Few dare that job. The throne was not to be touched unless requested, but no one had told Elian to refuse. So he performed his task, carefully, with reverence, but still standing. Then came the day of the candle procession, a minor but symbolically loaded observance. The court gathered in the hall of coal flames, each member holding a small lit taper. The king walked the aisle slowly, inspecting each flicker. When he reached Elian, something extraordinary happened. The king stopped. He looked directly. This was unheard of. Valentine rarely acknowledged servants unless punishing them. The court did not breathe. Elian, taper in hand, met no eyes, but he did not kneel. The silence was thick. Even flames seemed to dim. The king raised his hand, a single finger, and then lowered it. He moved on. That night, Elian's bunk was stripped, his boots removed, his name scratched from the roster. He had not been seen disobeying, nor heard speaking out, but the refusal to kneel consistently, quietly, had been enough. The message was clear. No rebellion was too small, no defiance too silent. And yet, and this is the heart of it, no one filled Elian's place. The robes he once folded were now handled by two others. The whisper throne remained duller than before. The fold angles were off and off. His absence was not discussed, but his memory, strangely, remained. Because for all their obedience, the others had seen what he did. They had seen a man stand in a place built to crush, and they had felt something, a twitch in the spine, a tension in the knees, something they hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not pride, but possibility. And in the months that followed, more servants began adjusting their bows. Just slightly, just slowly. Nothing the king could name, but enough to change the rhythm of the court. The silence remained, but it had an echo now, the ghost of a man who refused to bend. And in the shadows of the tall corridor, where Elian had last been seen, a mark appeared on the stone. A scratch, no deeper than a fingernail. No one knew who made it, but those who looked close said it resembled a single vertical line. Straight, unbroken, a spine, a symbol. And so, the memory of Elian lived, not in songs or scrolls, but in the subtle shift of posture, in the whispers behind shut doors, in the knowledge that obedience, once challenged, could never be as perfect again. Let us now leave the cold echo of upright rebellion and turn to what followed, the surge of punishments, when the court, sensing the tremble of dissent, lashed out with unrestrained ferocity. We stepped next into the season of red dust, when discipline returned in floods, and the king's mercy ran dry. There are seasons in every kingdom that are remembered not for their harvests or their weather, but for the silence that follows them. In Varellan, one such season came to be known in hushed whispers and soot-stained journal margins as the season of red dust, a name not officially proclaimed, never marked on a calendar, but burned into the memories of all who lived through it. It began not with war, nor with revolt, but with something quieter, discomfort. Discomfort in the king's eyes, discomfort in the precision of bows, discomfort in the air, heavy with questions never spoken. The king had noticed the court shifting, though no one openly defied him, and every ceremony continued with its practiced grace. There was something different. The silence felt too still. The obedience rehearsed. Even the punishments no longer inspired quite the same fear. And worst of all, in the corners of the palace, some had begun to remember Elian, the man who had not knelt. He had left no words, no firebrand speeches, and yet somehow his absence spoke louder than any rebellion. This would not be allowed. And so began the season of red dust, not with announcements or decrees, but with a disappearance. On the first night of the season, 3 scribes were taken from the east wing. No one heard them go. Their scrolls were left mid-written, ink still wet. The following night, a steward vanished from the kitchens, then 2 guards from the Hall of Vows. Each day, a few more gone, and not just removed, erased, their names scraped from rosters, their duties redistributed as if they'd never existed. Then the executions began. They were not public, not at first. The punishments were quiet, clinical, almost symbolic. A door left ajar with blood beneath it. A bucket overturned beside a still warm hearth. A ring, once worn by a servant, left in a puddle with no owner in sight. The message was unmistakable. You are watched. You are not safe. And you are never too small to matter. Fear returned like a flood. Where postures had begun to soften, they now stiffened into statues. Knees bent deeper. Eyes stayed down longer. Servants stopped speaking entirely unless addressed. Even the nobility, those whose lineage once protected them, began to falter. They shortened their walks. They sent proxies to speak on their behalf. Some refused invitations to court altogether, choosing the risk of insult over the certainty of death. But this only made things worse. The king, seeing absence as defiance, began demanding attendance. Every lord, every page, every scribe, summoned to the grand chamber once each week, not to advise, not to serve, but to kneel, one by one, for hours. They knelt while the king sat unmoving, watching. No words, no movement, just the weight of his gaze and the scraping sound of knees on cold stone. It was during this period that the executions became more visible, public, though still without ceremony. One day, a tapestry was removed from the west wall. Behind it, a new installation appeared, a row of hooks, each bearing a single item, a belt, a slipper, a lock of hair, a folded tunic. No names, no labels, but everyone knew what they meant. They were reminders, a way of making the silence scream. And then one morning, the red dust appeared. It began as a strange powder, swept across the eastern courtyard, fine and rust-colored, like crushed brick or dry blood. At first, the servants thought it wind-blown ash, perhaps from the chimney stacks. But it returned again the next day, thicker, and then again, coating the garden stones, clinging to fountain edges, dusting the steps leading to the scriptorium. No one knew its origin. No fire had been recorded. No building burned. But those who had lived through the earliest purges, the first silence, remembered, long ago, before the reign of Valentine, when justice was still loud, the court had burned criminals in public, not with ceremony, but with fury. The bodies, unclaimed, were reduced to ash and bone and spread across the fields. Some claimed the red dust was from those old bones, disturbed by the restless spirits of the forgotten. Others believed it was new, the result of something darker beneath the palace, some hidden furnace that worked without pause. Whatever its source, the meaning was clear. Dust is all that will remain of disobedience. And so, even those who had begun to forget fear now remembered it. Whispers stopped entirely. Smiles vanished. No one mentioned Elian again. Even the simple act of walking became cautious. One foot placed precisely after the other, as if the stones themselves were listening. A poet, long after, wrote of the season. The walls grew ears, and the dust had teeth. We breathed like mice, and dreamed in grief. The executions increased. Now they included nobles. Lord Renwin, once a favor of the court, was found hanging in the western alcove, a message carved into the wood above his head. He leaned too far. No one asked what that meant. But the next day, every bow was deeper, every gesture smaller. The red dust began appearing indoors, thin streaks along windowsills, piles beneath beds. In one terrifying case, inside a scribe's ink bottle. The court began to believe the dust was watching them. A few went mad. Some chose exile, abandoning lands, titles, and names to flee to the borderlands where Varellan's silence did not reach. But even beyond the mountains, the red dust was whispered of, as if it clung to the memory of those who had lived through it. And yet, even during this darkest season, even as discipline turned to brutality and submission became blood-tinged ritual, the seeds of resistance did not die. They hid, they quieted, they waited, because somewhere deep beneath the palace, in the unlit corridors and forgotten servant paths, the memory of those who had refused to kneel still breathed. In the cracks between the stones, in the scratch of quills, in the flicker of unwatched flames, rebellion smoldered like a coal hidden beneath ash, waiting. But for now, the king reigned, and obedience, however fragile, wore a mask of permanence. Still, every regime has its breaking point. And so, we now enter the turning hour, when the silence itself began to betray the crown, and obedience, like all things, showed its cracks. The court of Varellan, for all its cruelty, was not eternal. No silence can last forever. No fear, however absolute, is without its fraying edge. And it was in the narrow space between terror and fatigue that the turning hour arrived, not as a revolution, not as a cry, but as a barely audible shift in the air, a pause between inhalations, when the world held its breath and dared to consider something else. No one named it at the time. There was no hour struck, no declaration written, no visible uprising. But history, that slow, patient collector of meaning, later traced all changes back to a single, forgotten moment. A moment so unremarkable it passed unnoticed by many, and yet it would prove to be the fulcrum upon which the entire kingdom would tilt. It began with a servant's breath. Her name was Miri. She was young, perhaps too young for the burden of history, and yet she carried it anyway, without asking, without knowing. Miri worked in the lower libraries, the dustiest, coldest part of the palace, where no one of import ever walked. She polished the iron candlesticks, changed the wax-sealed scroll ties, and occasionally brought water to the few ancient scholars who had survived long enough to be considered harmless. Her presence was invisible, like steam in the winter air. But unlike most servants, Miri read. She read everything. Not just the ledgers and the food lists, not just the cleaning schedules or the etiquette manuals. She read the old books, the forbidden ones, the ones with frayed covers and broken spines, the ones shoved deep into the stone alcoves that hadn't been touched since before Valentine's reign. She read stories of older kings, gentler ones, tyrants, reformers, lunatics. She read of courts that once laughed, of festivals held without fear, of songs that echoed through halls now long silent. She read of laws, real laws, with written clauses and appeal, not the shadow rules of posture and performance that now govern Varellin. And she began to wonder. That was all. Just wonder. Was it always this way? Could it be otherwise? It was a dangerous question. The most dangerous of all. Not a challenge. Not defiance. But doubt. Because doubt, once seated, grows in silence like a root through stone. And the stone of Varellin's court had been untouched for far too long. The moment of change, the turning hour itself, came one morning as soft as snowfall. The king had summoned procession of kneeling, a new ritual meant to reaffirm loyalty after the troubling months of red dust. All members of the court, including servants, were required to enter Grand Hall one by one, kneel before the whispered throne, and place their forehead to the ground for exactly 7 breaths. To rise too early was rebellion. To stay too long was seen as mockery. Each subject knelt, forehead to marble, counting their breaths with careful rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and up. Then the next. It was mechanical, almost beautiful in its symmetry, like gears turning, like time itself. Until Miri's turn came. She knelt, she lowered her head, and she began to breathe. 1, 2, 3, 4. But on the 5th breath, something happened. She exhaled softly, slowly, and in that moment, something inside her shifted. Maybe it was the memory of a phrase she had read the night before. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe it was the ancient instinct of a world that had been wrong for too long. But instead of rising after the 7th breath, she kept breathing. 8, 9, 10, 11, and the court noticed. The attendants stirred. A ripple passed through the silent assembly. The king's hand twitched. Still, she remained, forehead to the floor, silent, still breathing. 12, 13, 14. It was not rebellion. She had not stood early. She had not refused to kneel. She was in every way complying, just for longer, too long. And that alone was enough to break the ritual's rhythm, because the power of silence lay in its predictability. And Miri had introduced a pause, a tiny fracture in time, a place where rules bent without shattering, where obedience blurred into something harder to define. She stayed there until 20 breaths had passed. Then, slowly, deliberately, she rose, eyes down, hands folded. She said nothing. She bowed, once, and she left the hall. No one stopped her. The next day, nothing changed. But the day after that, during the same ritual, another servant took 8 breaths. Then 9, then 12. Then, the 3rd day, one nobleman paused just slightly before rising. And then the 4th day, no one counted aloud. It became unspoken, a new pattern, a bending within the bending, a movement within stillness. And with each shift, the king grew more still. His eyes narrowed. His fingers curled tighter on the throne's armrest. But he did not speak, because speaking would be an admission that his silence was no longer absolute. And so, for the first time in decades, the silence belonged to everyone, not just the crown. It was no longer a weapon, but a shared space, an open field, a place where fear might yet be replaced by something slower, something deeper, understanding. This was a turning hour. It passed like a breath, invisible, but irreversible. For in Varellon, the first breath of change had arrived. And from that breath, others would follow. Whispers would return, then voices, then laughter. But not yet, for now, the silence remained. But it was a silence that listened, not one that crushed. Let us now drift into the hours that followed, when the king, feeling power slip from his grasp, turned inward and began to reshape his own rituals. In these next moments, we will explore the mask of mercy, an illusion of kindness wielded like a blade. In the days following the turning hour, as the breath of change lingered in the walls of Varellon's palace, King Valentine did not respond with thunder or flame. He did not order mass executions, nor storm through the corridors like a wrathful god. No, his response was far quieter, and therefore far more terrifying. He chose to respond not with rage, but with mercy, or at least what looked like it. The court began to notice small changes. Where once transgressions were met with immediate removal or silent death, they were now greeted with pardons, warnings, smiles. A servant who dropped a goblet in the great hall was forgiven. The king even chuckled softly. A scribe who stumbled over a ceremonial phrase during the recitation of ancestral names was allowed to repeat it. A visiting lord who failed to bow at the precise depth expected was not escorted away, but invited to sit closer. At first, the court exhaled. Was this the beginning of a new era? Had the whispers of change, the deeper breaths, the slight hesitations softened the king? Was his iron rule finally melting into something more human? But those who had lived long in Varellon knew better. They understood the king too well. Valentine was not a man who lost control. He was a man who redirected it. And what they now saw was not mercy, but the most dangerous thing of all, performative clemency, a mercy designed not to forgive, but to control through confusion. Where fear had once ruled by certainty, bend or die, mercy now ruled through uncertainty. The rules were no longer rigid. They were pliable, vague. And this, somehow, was worse. Because a known cruelty can be anticipated. It can be braced against. But kindness given without logic, kindness granted without warning, kindness that might disappear at any moment, that is a noose one cannot see tightening. The servants quickly learned this. The day after Miri's quiet defiance, she was promoted, made keeper of the lesser scrolls, an honor rarely granted to someone so young. The court murmured. Was this reward? Recognition? An attempt to silence? Miri accepted with her usual quiet, but inside she knew it was a trap, a soft leash dressed in silk. Not long after, another servant, old Edrin, a cellar sweep who had worked in the wine vault since before Valentine's coronation, was called before the court. He had spoken gently to a steward, nothing more than a quiet joke about candle wax and long winters. Such things were once death sentences. But not now. The king smiled. "Let him speak again," he said, waving his hand as if blessing a child. The court laughed, unsure, nervous, but obedient. And Edrin laughed too, though his eyes trembled. He left the hall unharmed. A miracle. 2 nights later, Edrin vanished. His bed was empty. His boots gone. His name removed. No explanation. No farewell. Just silence. This became the pattern. Mercy one day. Disappearance the next. Kindness followed by absence. The court learned not to trust the smile. They feared it more than the scowl. And yet they had to smile back. To not accept the king's mercy was to question it. And to question mercy, even gently, was treason. It was during this time that the king began wearing a new mask. Not literal, not cloth or iron, but a performance, a role. The benevolent monarch. He held feasts again, opened the courtyards, invited poets to read. Bards sang old songs in the gallery. The wine flowed freely, but the guards doubled. The shadows grew longer, and beneath every cup of spiced plum wine was the unspoken fear. Is this my last drink? Even the nobles, once confident in their status, began to suffer the burden of this new rule. They were gifted titles, meaningless ones, invented for the day, and stripped of them the next. One was named Defender of the Autumn Wind, and seated beside the throne for a single hour, only to be reassigned to the outer provinces before sundown, his estate seized. Another was invited to recite a poem in court, a rare honor. The poem was mild, nostalgic, yet halfway through, the king stood. "That is enough," he said. The poet was never seen again. Mercy, in Valentine's hands, was a game, a theater of power, a way to unnerve without touching, to disarm without striking, to control not through force, but through the illusion of generosity. The court was now a house of mirrors. No one knew which reflection was real. The servants began to dread kindness more than cruelty. They longed for the old certainty, harsh as it was, because it at least made sense. Now, a warm smile could mean a reward, or a disappearance. A second chance could be real, or a test. One day, the king called for a festival of light, a tradition not celebrated since the early days of his rule. Lanterns were hung, music played, children were allowed into the garden. The air was thick with rose water and baked pears. People wept with relief. It felt almost joyful. That night, 27 servants were removed from the rosters. No reason, no pattern. The festival was simply the distraction. The mask of mercy had become the most effective tool of all, more than the red dust, more than silence, because it rewrote reality. It made the people doubt their own instincts. It made them second-guess fear. And so they became paralyzed, not with terror, but with confusion. How do you survive in a world where good things might be punishments, where punishment wears the face of grace? The courtiers shrank into themselves. The servants spoke even less. But deep below, beneath this layer of honeyed horror, something else stirred, because the mask, while powerful, was still a mask, and all masks must eventually slip. Even the king could not smile forever. Even mercy grows thin when wielded as a blade. And so we now drift forward, past the feasts, past the disappearances, past the counterfeit kindness, to a place where the mask begins to crack. We now enter the day of unmasking, when the performance faltered and all saw the king for what he truly was. The mask of mercy could not last. Even the most convincing lie cannot sustain itself indefinitely without the truth pushing at its edges. The people of Arellan had long since learned to survive under cruelty, but it was a mercy, cold, calculated, and unpredictable, that unspooled their minds and spirits. But masks, no matter how skillfully worn, are bound to crack under the weight of time and scrutiny. And when they do, the face behind them is never forgotten. The day of unmasking did not arrive with trumpets. It did not come with revolts or declarations, nor with crowds storming castle gates. It came with a chair, the whisper throne, a relic, ancient even in Valentine's youth, carved from ironwood and inlaid with bones believed to be from the first ancestors. Its legs were etched with riddles long lost to time. The throne was rarely empty, even when the king was not seated upon it. His cloak was draped over his high back, his seal ring placed upon his arm. The throne had become his presence, immutable, constant, and watching. And then, one morning, it was empty, not just unoccupied, bare. No cloak, no ring, no guards, just a throne. Alone, cold, open. This had never happened. Not in memory, not in story, not in legend. The silence in the grand hall was unlike any that had come before. It wasn't the usual hush of fear or the wary stillness of subjects awaiting command. It was a silence of expectation. And then the king entered. But something was wrong. He was dressed as always in dark robes stitched with golden vines, the crown of long thorns upon his brow. But there was no weight in his steps, no majesty in his posture. He walked not as a king, but as a man burdened by pretending to be one. He reached the throne, looked at it, and for a long, fragile moment, simply stood. Then, to the shock of all assembled, he turned around, faced court, and removed his crown. Not symbolically, not for ceremony. He removed it like a man removing a stone from his shoe, as if it no longer belonged to him, as if it had never fit at all. The weight of the gesture rippled through the chamber. One lord gasped audibly. A servant dropped her tray. Somewhere, a baby began to cry. The king raised a hand, not to quiet them, but to steady himself. And then he spoke. "My silence," he said slowly, voice cracked by age and effort, "was never strength. It was the only language I had left." The court did not understand. Was this confession? Was this trap? Was this mercy's final trick? "I have ruled through absence," he continued. "Absence of warmth, of joy, of justice, because that was what I understood. It was given to me, and I carried it forward." He paused, looking at the throne. "It did not begin with me, and it will not end with me, but I am tired of its shape. I no longer recognize myself inside it." The room was frozen. Even the guards seemed unsure of their place. "Do you know why I executed?" he asked, his voice softer now, not addressing anyone in particular. "Because I feared I was not a real king. And in fear, a man kills what he cannot control. Mercy became a mirror I could not bear to look into. So I made it cruel, to twist its reflection." He looked up, eyes wet, yet still cold. "But mirror, once cracked, can no longer lie. And so I stand before you, not as king, but as a man who has run out of masks." He dropped the crown onto the floor. It clattered, rolled, and came to rest at the foot of the throne. Silence. True, unfiltered silence. No fear, no anticipation. Just the stillness of something ending. And yet, no one stepped forward. No one applauded. No one rebelled. Because this was not a victory. This was a moment of nakedness. A kingdom watching its emperor strip away the final veil. Not out of bravery, but because he had nothing left to wear. In that moment, pity joined the court, a new guest in the hall. Pity not for the people, but for the king, because they saw him now. Fully, clearly, not as a monster in stories, but as a man behind the curtain, terrified of his own shadow. And for a breath, they wondered, had he always been this small, or had his cruelty made him so? He stepped down from the dais and walked through the hall, unescorted for the first time in decades. No guard followed. No page led him. No banner waved. And no one stopped him. He walked out of the chamber, out of the palace, out of history. That was the last time anyone saw King Valentine. No one knows where he went, whether to a monastery, to exile, or to the mountains where sound is swallowed by snow. His name was never spoken again in official record, but the throne remained, empty, and that was its own kind of reign. For weeks, no one sat upon it. The court functioned in hesitant autonomy. Rules unraveled. Silence lifted. People began to speak again, not loudly, not rebelliously, but gently, as if learning a language they had long forgotten. The day of unmasking did not bring revolution. It brought clarity. It stripped power of its illusion. It allowed the people to see, perhaps for the first time, that kings are not gods, and masks, no matter how intricately designed, cannot forever hide the fragility of the human beneath. And so, as we leave the day of unmasking behind, we turn now to the slow dawn that followed, the careful reshaping of Ireland's court, and the unlikely voices who stepped forward to speak where once only silence ruled. We enter now the Parliament of Servants, where the humble dare to govern and the walls learn to listen. In the aftermath of the king's quiet departure, the palace of Ireland did not collapse. It did not burn, nor fracture, nor fall to conquest. What happened instead was far stranger, and perhaps more profound. The kingdom, for the first time in living memory, stood without a voice giving it orders, without a hand forcing it to kneel, without a crown to chase or a face to fear. And in that strange stillness, a new sound began to rise. It was not a trumpet or drum, not a cry of war or triumph. It was a shuffling of feet, the clearing of throats, the hesitant clatter of worn shoes against stone floors that had only known the measured tread of nobility. It was a sound of servants, stepping into the light. For centuries, They had been the background, the silent breath of the palace. They swept, they scrubbed, they bowed. They overheard every secret, bore every cruelty, and vanished into the walls like whispers never meant to be heard. But now, with the king gone, the lords uncertain, and the throne chilling in its loneliness, the servants did what no one expected. They gathered. At first, it was little more than a meeting in the scullery. A few dozen of them, laundresses, butlers, scribes, cooks, lamp-keepers, and stable hands, sat in a circle around an extinguished hearth, speaking softly, as if the walls still listened with murderous intent. Miri, the girl who once dared to breathe too long before the throne, sat among them, though she did not speak often. Her presence was quiet but constant, like the steady pressure of a river shaping stone. Their first meeting was simple. "What do we do?" asked a wrinkled man who had spent half his life maintaining the brass sconces of the Eastern Gallery. "Work?" suggested a maid whose hands were still stained with beetroot. "No," someone else said. "I mean about the throne, the laws, everything." Silence followed. Not the old kind, cold and forced, frightened, but the new kind, the thinking kind. "We do what we've always done," said a gardener's apprentice. "Only this time for ourselves." And so, the Parliament of Servants began, not by decree, not by right, but by necessity. And though it bore the name of power, it held no crowns, no swords, no gilded robes. Its members wore aprons and ink-stained sleeves. Their tools were brooms and ledgers, not scepters. But they knew more of the palace than any noble ever had. They knew who truly kept Varellon running, not those who gave orders, but those who quietly answered them. They knew where the drafts whispered in from the cracks in the north wall. They knew which stair groaned and which lock stuck, and which chandeliers leaned a little too far to the left. They knew the stores of grain, the wax counts, the ink levels, and how many chickens the kitchens truly needed. Not how many the nobles believed they needed. They knew truth, and truth, when given voice, is the foundation of every honest power. At first, the nobles scoffed. They still believed in the old world, where blood dictated rule and chairs on raised platforms held magic. But time has a way of revealing emptiness, and an empty throne is just a chair. So when the Parliament began to hold meetings in the Hall of Lanterns, a side wing long and used except for storage, it was ignored. When they began sending out inventories and food allocations, the kitchens complied, assuming some royal steward had approved. When the Parliament suggested a new water schedule for the servants' quarters, the well-men obeyed. And when the Parliament posted a list of names of those who had quietly vanished under the king's reign, a hush spread through court, not of fear but of reckoning, because those names were not forgotten. They were family, friends, lovers, ghosts of smiles once shared in dim corridors. To see them listed, formally, in black ink on vellum, was to name the silence that had ruled them all. It was the Parliament's first true act of power. They acknowledged the dead, not just with whispers or candles, but with memory, with record, with truth. And once truth was written, it could not be unwritten. Within weeks, more meetings followed. The Parliament established roles, not titles, but tasks, rotating leadership, shared votes, notes posted publicly, and minutes taken in triplicate. No one was above another. Even Miri, who many had begun to look upon with quiet reverence, insisted on folding chairs and cleaning after meetings. "We are servants still," she said once, "but now we serve each other." And so Varellon changed, not with revolt or banners, but with cooperation. The kitchens were run more efficiently. The guards, many of whom had grown tired pretending they didn't fear the king, took their orders from Parliament stewards. The treasury was open, not pillaged, but examined, catalogued, and redistributed. Streets were cleaned, lanterns lit on time, sick cared for. And slowly, very slowly, a new kind of order emerged, not a command, but a consensus. The Parliament did not govern with iron. It governed with memory, responsibility, and a kind of tired hope that perhaps, after everything, there was still a way forward. It wasn't perfect. Of course not. Old habits die slowly. Some lords resisted. Some power-hungry voices tried to hijack meetings. But the Parliament endured, not because it was strong, but because it was necessary. Because someone had to remember the forgotten, someone had to name the silenced, and someone had to decide that the throne, once so feared, so worshipped, could stay empty, not as an insult, not as a rebellion, but as a reminder that power, once broken, should never again wear a mask. And so the whisper throne gathered dust, and the parliament of servants gathered truth. As the seasons turned and the kingdom settled into its new rhythm, those who had lived through the reign began to teach again. They taught their children the value of breath, of pause, of asking why. And they taught the story of the man who ruled through silence, and the servants who found their voice. Let us now move forward, past the halls of power, into the homes and fields where this change echoed, and explore the legacy of the kneeling, where ordinary people rewrote the meaning of obedience forever. Though kings may vanish and courts may crumble, gestures often outlive the hands that created them. In Varellin, where for generations the act of kneeling had signified subjugation, submission, and silence, it would have been easy, perhaps even natural, to discard the posture entirely once the tyrant was gone, to erase the memory of bent spines and lowered heads, as one might scrub away blood from stone. But the people of Varellin did not abandon the kneel. Instead, in a soft, almost sacred twist of meaning, they reclaimed it. It began modestly, without fanfare. At first, it was just Miri again. Several months after the Parliament of Servants had formed and begun its work, Miri visited the Grand Hall. The throne was still there, untouched. No one dare remove it, but neither did anyone sit upon it. Dust had softened its ironwood frame, and cobwebs curled in the crevices where once the king's seal ring had rested. The hall itself remained quiet, not the hollow silence of the past, but the respectful hush of a tomb or a library. Miri did not approach the throne. She did not touch it. Instead, she walked halfway down the length of the chamber, stopped at the exact place she had once knelt all those months before, and did so again. She bent slowly, deliberately, and lowered her head to the cold stone floor. But this time, she was not counting breaths in fear. She was remembering. She was honoring. It was not obedience. It was ownership. She stayed for a long moment, then stood and walked away. No one asked why. But a week later, another servant did the same. Then a scribe. Then a lantern lighter. Soon, on the first day of each month, a quiet procession began to form. Not of nobles in gold-threaded cloaks, but of commoners, workers, children, elders, all gathering not to serve a crown, but to pay silent tribute to the cost of silence. They called it the kneeling, not because they had to, but because they chose to. The act was transformed. No longer a tool of suppression. It became an emblem of collective memory. A way to say, we remember what was done here. We remember those who vanished. We remember how close we came to forgetting ourselves. And memory, as it turned out, was stronger than fear. Soon, people began kneeling outside the palace too, in town squares, in front of old prisons, in gardens where gallows once stood. Sometimes they brought candles. Sometimes they brought names. Sometimes they simply knelt with nothing but their breath, like leaves carried on an ancient wind. Children asked why, and for the first time in generations, the adults had an answer. They told the story of the red dust, of the court silence, of the whisper throne, and of the man who ruled by saying nothing. But most of all, they told the story of the people who had endured, the ones who had bent and survived, the ones who had stayed and remembered, and most especially, the ones who had breathed just a little longer than they were told to. Schools began teaching a new lesson, not in grand banners or royal decrees, but in simple stories passed from mouth to mouth. The curriculum included no royal dates or battle names, only questions. What does it mean to be quiet? What does it mean to listen? When should one kneel and when should one stand? The answers were never the same. That was the point. The kneeling spread beyond Varellin's borders. Travelers from distant towns and principalities, hearing whispers of the court with no king, visited the palace. They watched the monthly procession. They knelt, too, awkwardly at first, then reverently. They returned home with stories not of gold or glory, but of humility, of people who had made something sacred out of something once used to harm them. It confused many rulers, infuriated others, but it could not be stopped. because the kneeling was not a protest, nor a threat. It was simply a reminder, a signal that power, when twisted, leaves scars. But that scars, too, can be beautiful if they're honestly remembered. Over the years, the tradition evolved. On the day of Valentine's death, whenever it may have occurred, for no one ever discovered where he'd gone, the Parliament declared a national day of quiet. Not mourning, not celebration, just stillness. On this day, across the kingdom, shops closed, bells did not ring, and people walked without speaking from sunrise to sunset. It was called the long breath, a gift from Miri, who had once taken a breath too long, and in doing so, helped start the unraveling of an empire. She, now elderly, never claimed any credit. She remained a quiet figure in the Parliament, often sweeping the same floor she once knelt upon. But each year, during the kneeling, she would be the first to lower her head and the last to rise. Children asked if she was a queen now. She only smiled. "There are no more queens or kings," she would say. "Only those who remember." And remembering in Varellan became a kind of leadership, not by decree, but by presence, by bearing witness, by teaching others how to bend without breaking. In time, the Whisper Throne was moved, not to a museum, nor destroyed, but placed beneath glass in the Hall of Lanterns. Visitors were allowed to approach it, study it, even sit beside it, but never upon it. There were no guards, just a small plaque, etched in simple script. "This chair once ruled us all, not by strength, not by wisdom, but by our silence. May we never offer such gifts so freely again." And so the throne remained empty but not forgotten, not a symbol of power anymore, but of its misuse. And the people, who once knelt out of fear, continued to kneel from memory, because remembering was the only way forward. Let us now continue, as the memory of the king begins to fade from flesh into fable, and the people of Varellan navigate a world finally free of chains, but not yet free of shadows. In our next part, we enter the Library of the Lost, where stories that were nearly destroyed found new life in pages written by those who once dared not speak. After the kingdom found its breath again, and silence was no longer the currency of survival, something curious began to happen within the outermost wing of the palace, the West Annex, where once broken furniture and faded portraits were stacked like bones in a crypt. That wing, choked in dust and dark with sealed shutters, had for years been unused. The corridors were lined with half-burned books, empty shelves, and scrolls so brittle they disintegrated under a glance. They were remnants of an older court, older rules, older truths, all of them erased, censored, or simply abandoned under the long shadow of King Valentine's reign. It was Miri again who first stepped inside, not with ceremony, but while searching for old parchment for Parliament records. Her candle lit upon the fragments of forgotten stories. Memoirs half-scrawled, law books blackened at the edges, testimonies written in the frantic hand of those who knew they would not survive the day. She found pages that had been buried behind walls, tucked into floorboards, or hidden between false covers labeled inventory or tax records. They were stories not meant to be found, and yet they had waited. Word of her discovery spread slowly, not shouted in streets, but passed hand to hand, like an ember kept beneath ash. Before long, scribes began appearing in the annex, then historians, then children, curious and wide-eyed, guided by teachers who whisper the past as something worth honoring, not erasing. The Parliament soon declared the wing a sanctuary of memory, untouched by decree or politics. It was named the Library of the Lost, not because the stories were gone, but because the people who told them had been taken too soon. Now, their words will remain. At first, the library was unorganized, a scattering of papers rescued from the jaws of oblivion. But slowly, with careful hands and soft brushes, the past was pieced together. Old testimonies were rewritten, not altered, just preserved. Pages were dried and flattened. Ink was darkened where it had faded. Every effort was made to retain the authenticity of fear, the tremble in handwriting, the corrections scrawled in panic, the blood stains that no longer startled but solemnly marked their place. One entire room was dedicated to letters, not royal correspondence or declarations, but personal letters, from mothers to daughters, lovers to soldiers, scribes to gods. Many had never been delivered. Some had been intercepted during the years of silence and left to rot in vaults. They spoke of longing, of courage, of quiet resistance, and above all, of hope. One letter, dated 30 years before the king's fall, read, "They told me to speak less. So I did, but my thoughts never obeyed. I write them here, in case someone find them, in case someone remembers me not as quiet, but as someone who tried." It was unsigned, but the Parliament framed it near the entrance of the library. It became a kind of motto, a quiet invocation to all who entered. We are remembered not for ourselves, but for those who were never allowed to finish their sentences. Soon, new sections began to form. A wing for forbidden poems, verses that once circled in whispers, blame for rebellion, though they spoke only of grief. A hall of oral histories, recorded painstakingly from the memories of aging servants and citizens who had seen the old court firsthand. A vault of censored plays, dramas smuggled out during the reign, performed only in secret cellars, their scripts now restored and recited for eager listeners. And then the Hall of the Red Dust, a space kept dimly lit, painted in muted hues, where the testimonies of those who had vanished under the king's punishment were preserved. Here were the names, faces, and final words, as many as could be recovered, of those who had disappeared into silence. Miri spent countless hours here. She never said why. She didn't need to. Visitors were allowed to light a small candle at the end of the hall and place it on a shelf. No prayer required. Just presence. Each flame told its own story. The library did not operate like a typical archive. It was not hushed, but hallowed. People spoke softly, not out of rule, but out of reverence. Children were encouraged to ask questions. Elders were invited to correct what the documents got wrong. The library listened in a way the court never had. Perhaps the most remarkable section was the wall of unfinished stories. Here, parchment hung in rows, each page with beginning. A sentence, a phrase, an idea, but no end. These were the fragments left behind by those taken too early. Visitors were invited to complete them, not as they imagined the author would have, but as themselves, as part of a shared memory. One read, "The candle flickered once, and then..." A child had written below, "I held it closer and found my mother's face again." These additions were marked in blue ink to distinguish them, not a divide, but to honor the collaboration between past and present. It was an act of healing, of participation, of bearing witness. Over time, the library began to attract attention beyond Varellin. Scholars from other lands wrote letters requesting access. Rulers from nearby courts sent emissaries to learn how a kingdom could survive after abandoning the throne. They found no manuals, no laws, no doctrine, only pages, voices, and silence, the respectful kind. When asked who governed the library, the Parliament replied simply, "The lost do." And indeed they did. Their words shaped the policies of the new kingdom. Their stories were read aloud before decisions were made. No law passed without first consulting the past, because Varellin had learned, painfully, slowly, that forgetting was the first cruelty, and that silence, when left unchallenged, becomes its own kind of tyrant. So they remembered, not with monuments or statues, but with pages, pens, and the open hands of those who had once been told to keep them folded. Let us now move deeper into the lands beyond the palace, where the change that began in quiet halls began to seep into distant fields and foreign courts, and where the spirit of the forgotten shaped a kingdom without a king. There was no coronation, no velvet banners, no golden horns, no crown lifted on high as a symbol of unity or divine favor. The fall of the last king and the quiet rise of the Parliament of Servants ushered in a future so rare in the annals of history, it seemed almost accidental. A kingdom without a king. And yet, remarkably, stunningly, it did not fall into chaos. Varellin, once ruled by silence and fear, did not collapse into lawlessness as many foreign courts had predicted. There were no great sieges, no waves of famine, no endless wars of succession. What rose instead, slowly and haltingly, was something softer, something less majestic, perhaps, but infinitely more human. This was not because the people of Varellin were naturally wiser, or that the Parliament was miraculously incorruptible. It was because they remembered what it had cost them to forget their own worth. The memory of the reign still ached in their bones. The whisper throne still sat behind glass. The kneeling still occurred on the first day of every month. And most importantly, no one, not even Miri, sought to replace the king. In other lands, news of this strange kingdom traveled on wind and parchment. Ambassadors from grand empires arrived, expecting to find a temporary council waiting for its next monarch. What they found instead were shared ledgers, handwritten laws, and parliament halls where butchers and scribes debated alongside former knights and cooks. They found a nation run by cooperation, not command, and it baffled them. But who gives the final order? They would ask, staring at the great seal used to formalize new policies. And the answer, always delivered with polite firmness, was, no one. We vote. In Varellan, leadership was a borrowed cloak, not a crown. Roles were rotated. Speakers served terms. Decision-making was slow, deliberate, and often messy. But that mess was considered a virtue, the sign of many voices learning how to speak, and more importantly, how to listen. The structure that emerged was nothing like the brutal order of the past. At the village level, councils were formed, comprised of 5 to 7 members chosen by open discussion, not secret ballots. Their task was not command, but to collect concerns and present them to the regional forums. Their representatives from each district gathered monthly, bringing with them stories rather than demands. These forums held no power to punish, only to propose. And above all, in the Parliament of Servants, which met quarterly in the capital, a chair always sat empty, not out of neglect, but as a reminder. This chair bore no plaque, no banner, no name, but all who entered the chamber knew what it represented. It was where the king would have sat. Now it stood for restraint, for memory, for humility. The people of Varellan, having once been ruled by the absence of voice, had learned not to replace that silence with noise, but with dialogue. Decisions were debated over weeks. Proposals had to pass through 3 rounds of listening sessions before being considered law. Nothing moved quickly, not because of inefficiency, but by design. The kingdom understood now that swiftness had once been the handmaiden of tyranny. Children learned the story in school, not as a single tale, but as a woven tapestry of many voices. They did not memorize dates of royal births or wars won, but instead recited the names of those who had spoken when forbidden to, the letters recovered from the library of the lost, the testimonies read aloud at each council to remind the room of what had been endured. Foreign nobles continued to scoff. One prince from a northern empire famously remarked, "They have no crown, no court, no chain of command. What keeps their kingdom from splintering?" He was answered not with swords, but with scrolls, copies of communal charters, food-sharing agreements, and hundreds of stories collected by scribes who walked the countryside documenting the everyday workings of a land where power had no single seat. The prince never returned, but his letter, the one sent to his court, filled with grudging admiration, was framed in the Parliament's Hall of Visitors. In time, other nations began to take note, not because Varellan conquered or expanded or dazzled with wealth, but because its people stayed. They stayed when they could have fled. They remembered when it would have been easier to forget. They continued to kneel not in fear, but in reflection, year after year, under falling leaves and blooming skies. And they chose not to crown anyone. This decision was not without its critics. There were whispers, as there always are, of returning to the old ways. Some called for structure, hierarchy, symbols. Some longed for simplicity of having a single figure to revere or blame. And occasionally, small factions rose up in favor of restoring the throne. But they faded quickly, not because they were silenced, but because they were heard. And hearing, as the Parliament had learned, is often the most disarming force of all. In markets and on farms, in taverns and temples, the people of Varellan lived with a new awareness. They spoke slower, chose their words carefully, respected pause as a part of conversation, because they had known a time when silence was survival, and they had survived it. Now, silence was used differently. It became space, to think, to breathe, to remember, and so The kingdom without a king endured, not through divine right or iron will, but through shared responsibility, the weight of memory carried together, like a yoke across 1,000 shoulders. No one ruled, and yet, somehow, everything worked. Let us now move into the quiet heart of this transformed realm, to a story not of leaders or laws, but the last executioner, a man who once enforced the will of the throne, and who now sought a kind of penance not with rope or blade, but with ink and forgiveness. He lived at the edge of the kingdom, in a hut that bent beneath the weight of ivy and time. His name was Tarnum, though few knew it. Most, if they knew him at all, remembered only the whispered title that trailed after his shadow like smoke. The Last Executioner. Not because he had been the final one appointed to the role, but because he had been the last one to lift the blade during King Valentine's reign. Tarnum did not return to the palace after the king disappeared. He did not join the parliament of servants. He did not kneel in the grand hall, or speak at the forums, or even attend the long breath. Instead, he walked away, past the iron gates, past the edge of Ireland's cobbled streets, beyond the fields where memories softened under soil and sweat, and into the forest, where only birds and old spirits made company of the living. Some believed he had vanished. Others assumed he had taken his own life in shame. But he had done neither. He had chosen exile, not from punishment, but from conscience. Tarnum had been a young man when the crown chose him. Chosen, not asked. His hands had been strong, his heart untested, and his silence obedient. He remembered the day he was summoned, though he had tried to forget it for years. There had been no ceremony, just a pair of leather gloves handed to him with a quiet command. You will do as asked. He had, for 23 years. He did not relish it, but he did not resist either. He told himself what they all told themselves in those days. This is survival. But each time he sharpened the blade, each time he cleaned it in water that turned red and warm, something inside him dulled. Until one day, it didn't dull, it broke. That day, they had brought forth a girl. Young, no older than his daughter had been when she died of fever. The girl's only crime was speaking aloud in the Hall of Lanterns, repeating a line of poetry the king had outlawed. Tarnum had stared at her, waiting for the order to be rescinded, for someone to step in. No one did, and so he raised the blade. But when the echo of steel against bone faded, something inside him did not fall silent. It screamed. It screamed in a way that never stopped. From that day on, he no longer felt anything in his hands. They were instruments only, not of duty, but of regret. So when the king fled and the silence cracked and the parliament rose, Tarnum knew there was no place for him in the new kingdom, not because they had cast him out, but because he could not forgive himself. Instead, he built his hut. He grew herbs, not for cooking, but for ink. He carved wooden stamps from tree bark and old bones. He flattened reeds into brushes, and he began to write. Not memoirs, not explanations, names. Every name he remembered, every face, every breath he had cut short. He wrote them on bark, on cloth, on stones, on the inside his walls. His home became a shrine of sorrow, not to honor what he had done, but to refuse forgetting. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not believe he deserved it. He only believed that remembering was his last task. And so, every morning before the sun rose, Tarnum sat on a wooden stool outside his door and recited the names. It took hours. He often wept, but never once did he fail to speak them. Eventually, word of his presence reached the parliament. Some argued he should be brought to trial. Others said he had already sentenced himself to a life worse than any verdict could offer. But Miri, upon hearing his name, simply said, "Let him remember. That's more than the king ever did." Years passed, and then one autumn, when the air had turned to ash-colored fog, a child found the hut. She had wandered from a nearby village while chasing a squirrel. She returned home not with nuts or stories of animals, but with a question. Who is the man who writes names on trees? The story began to spread, not sensationally, but quietly, like seeds on the wind. Visitors came cautiously at first, not pilgrims, not mourners, just the curious. Some expected a monster, others a madman. But what they found was an old man with ruined hands and eyes that did not blink when he spoke of what he had done. He never denied it. He never excused it. But he would always say, when asked why he stayed, "So they are not lost." One day Mary came. She was older now, frilier in body, but no less steady in voice. She walked into the hut, stood before the wall of names, and said only one word: "Thank you." Tarnum shook his head. "Don't." But she smiled softly. "Not for what you did, for what you've done since." They sat together in silence, the kind that didn't suffocate, but allowed space for breath. That night, she took one of his name scrolls, the one bearing only first initials and dates, and returned it to the Library of the Lost. It was placed in a frame under the heading, "Written by one who chose to remember." From then on, villagers would occasionally leave messages outside his hut, not letters of admiration, but confessions, small scraps of paper where they wrote things they were ashamed to tell anyone else. Tarnum never responded, but he kept every one. His hut, by the time of his death, was filled with the sorrow of a nation, and yet somehow, because of that, it felt lighter than any court had ever been. When he passed, quietly in his sleep, during a rainstorm, the Parliament did not hold a grand funeral, but they did one thing. On the edge of the village nearest his forest, they planted a tree. Beneath it, a simple stone. Here lived the last executioner. He remembered what others forgot, and he never asked to be forgiven, but he showed us how to mourn. And thus, the man who had once taken life became a guardian of memory, a symbol not of justice, but of reflection. In his silence, he taught a final lesson, that remorse, when paired with remembrance, can be its own kind of redemption. Let us now turn to the distant corners of Varellin, where the story of this transformation touched the lives of those beyond the palace walls, in the farmer's accord, where even the soil bore witness to the echoes of silence turned into song. Long before kings drew borders on parchment, the land knew its own truths. It did not recognize ownership, only care. The soil remembered only the hands that turned it, the feet that tread respectfully upon it, and the seeds buried with humble hope. In Varellin, the farmers had always known this, even when court refused to listen. During the reign of King Valentine, farming had been regulated not as livelihood, but as leverage. Crops were taxed before they grew. Fields were counted, measured, and often claimed by the crown without compensation. Those who grew too much were punished for excess. Those who grew too little were punished for laziness. Every season was a gamble, and every harvest an audit. But even then, amidst the fear, the farmers kept planting, because what else could they do? Soil was not something one could abandon. It was a relationship, and relationships, even abused ones, needed tending. When the king vanished and the parliament of servants began its slow, cautious work, no group was more skeptical than the farmers. They had no interest in royal proclamations or clever speeches. They had seen promises rot like grain stored in wet cellars. They had heard too many words from mouths that never touched earth. And yet, one early spring, a letter arrived at the foot of the Green Valley, the largest farming basin in Varellin. It was handwritten and signed and carried no official seal. It read, "The court no longer claims your grain. Plant what you wish. Eat what you grow. Sell what you choose. And if you are willing, teach us how you did so much with so little." At first, they thought it a trick. But when no tax collectors came, no auditors arrived, and no quotas were demanded, something unexpected began to grow. Not crops, not yet, trust. That year, for the first time in decades, the farmers chose their own seeds. No inspections, no penalties, just earth and rain, and the quiet thrill of self-determination. The fields bloomed in a way they hadn't in years. Sunflower rose like golden prayers. Barley that whispered in the wind like secrets forgiven. Cabbage heads heavy with promise. And wheat, tall, proud, uncounted. Still, when a representative from the parliament arrived in midsummer asking to speak, the farmers did not send their elders or councilmen. They sent a child. Her name was Etta. She was 9, because, as they later explained, if you can explain your intentions to a child, you can be trusted. The parliament envoy sat in the field and spoke to Etta for over an hour. She asked questions others might have hesitated to voice. Why did the king hate farmers? Will we be punished if we grow too much? What happens if you change your mind? The envoy answered honestly, I don't know. We hope not. And if we do change, I hope you'll remind us of today. That conversation became legend. It also became the rule of the Farmers' Accord, a set of agreements not written by nobles or scribes, but by farmers themselves. Using ink made from berry skins and paper pressed from flax, they wrote, 1. No person shall claim another's harvest without consent. 2. Trade shall be fair, weighed by hand, not law. 3. Seeds are knowledge, and knowledge is to be shared. 4. Land cannot be owned, only borrowed from time. 5. No voice is too small to ask why. They sent the accord to the Parliament, not with a plea, but with condition. Honor these, or send no more letters. The Parliament, to its credit, did not edit a single word. They read it aloud in session. Then, by unanimous vote, ratified the entire document into law. Thus, the farmers, who had once been voiceless under Crown, became the first to write binding policy in the new realm. The accord spread faster than wild time. Villages adopted it before it was even formally distributed. Traveling gardeners carried copies in their satchels. Even in towns where soil was thin and stony, the principles of the accord were adopted as philosophy, because it wasn't just about farming. It was about freedom with humility, about growth that answered the needs of people, not power. Soon, once neglected fields blossomed again. But more than that, relationships bloomed. Between regions, between towns, between people who had never before seen themselves as part of a larger whole. Farmers who had once hidden grain in false walls now held public markets. They sang songs once whispered in cellars, now out in the open air. And during harvest festivals, they shared not just produce, but stories. It became a custom at the end of each harvest for a circle to be drawn in the soil, and within that circle, someone would stand and tell a memory from the time before, not to dwell, but to remember. One old man, Arlen, whose hands were gnarled from years of tilling rocky earth, once stood in that circle and said, They made me pay for the rain, and now I give my neighbors water for free. That is my revenge. The crowd cheered, but softly, respectfully, because the land was listening. A new symbol emerged, carved into the wooden gates of farms. A stalk of wheat, bent in half, tied with string. It was not a sign of surrender, but of remembrance, that things could bend and still stand tall again. Eventually, the Farmers' Accord inspired other trades. Stoneworkers drafted their own principles. Weavers followed. Even storytellers began circulating their own agreements. Not contract of exclusivity, but pledges of truth and tenderness. The accord had proven something remarkable, that those who had been closest to ground, who had suffered most from being stepped on, could be the ones to guide a nation toward balance. And they did it without a throne, without a sword, only with seeds and words and time. Let us now step beyond the villages, to the furthest edges of Varellan, where the memory of silence met the winds of new curiosity, and where the children's caravan began to carry not just goods, but stories across lands that had once forgotten how to listen. It began, as most quiet revolutions do, with an idea so small it could have been missed. In the village of Belmere, nestled where the hills leaned gently into pine forests and the sky never quite forgot the color of dusk, a schoolteacher named Lorne had grown tired, not from age, but from repetition. He had taught his students the history of Varellan, the fall of the king, the silence, the parliament, the turning, year after year, always from the same pages. His students listened. Some even wept, but still something was missing. One day, a child named Van asked during a lesson, "Why do we only learn what happened here? Don't others need to know too?" Lorne smiled, then paused. It was a good question. Other kingdoms, far beyond the borders of Varellan, continue to operate under crowns, chains, and blindfolds of golden doctrine. Their people, much like Varellans once were, did not always know what had been lost. And Varellan, for all its scars, had something now worth sharing. Not power, not wealth, but remembrance. So Lorne proposed a journey, not of conquest, but of storytelling. He built a cart, Small at first, lined with shelves, blankets, and the soft hum of recorded voices. The children helped. They painted its sides with stars and trees in a single phrase, scrawled in a dozen languages. We remember so you can too. Thus was born the first children's caravan, a traveling classroom, library, and stage, pulled by a wide-eyed mule named Dapple and guided not by maps, but by invitation. They set out in early spring. 5 children, Lauren and Dapple. No guards, no banners, only scrolls and stories, each chosen by the children themselves. They visited the border towns first, places that had once trembled under the king's tax collectors. Now they watched in awe as children told tales not of kings, but of bakers who had bread in floorboards, farmers who recited poetry into the wind, scribes who risked everything to preserve the truth. The children did not perform like actors. They recited, softly, sincerely, often from memory, often in tears. Villagers gathered, not for spectacle, but for solidarity. Many brought their own stories. Some had never spoken of what they saw during the rain, believing their voices too small, their memories too painful, or their truth too unwelcome. But as the children listened, and they always listened, those walls began to soften. One evening, a woman named Brielle approached the caravan with a tattered book in her hands. It contained her journal entries from the silence, pages she had written in code, hidden beneath the floorboards of her cottage. She handed it to Fun and said, "I never thought anyone would care what I saw." Fun took the book gently, as if it were a baby bird. "We care. We carry." And they did. The book was copied and added to the caravan shelves. Soon more followed. Stories from towns the Parliament had yet to visit. Memories that had never made it to the Library of the Lost. Testimonies from those who had lived on the edges of the court's vision, but who had lived through the rain nonetheless. The caravan grew, not just in stories, but in scope. New wagons were added, each with a theme. One held songs once banned under the king's rule, lullabies sung in cellars, work songs hummed beneath breath. Funeral dirges turned into resistance chants. Another carried drawings, the first images of vanished faces, sketched by relatives who could now remember without fear. A third was filled with toys, not for distraction, but as memorials. Hand-carved dolls representing lost children, spinning tops engraved with names, a chessboard where every black piece bore initials of someone once sentenced for speaking. The caravan began to travel beyond Varellan's borders, into lands ruled by young monarchs, tired councils, or cities too busy to look back. They never forced their arrival. They asked, and more often than not, they were welcomed because children, it seemed, were harder to refuse than armies. They came not to convert, but to comfort. In one northern city, a ruler watched a performance from behind a veil, unmoved until a girl no older than 6 recited a poem written by a woman who had died for composing it. They told me silence was safe, but I found danger in forgetting. So I wrote this, and I buried it beneath my tongue, waiting for someone to listen. The ruler wept. That night, they signed a decree to abolish their censorship law. The children's caravan continued. New children joined each year. Others returned home to become teachers, historians, poets. No one was turned away, and no one was forced to speak. Many simply rode, listened, and slowly found courage blooming in their chests like a late-blooming flower. The Parliament of Varellan began recording the caravan's routes, archiving their collected stories, and providing support, not oversight. The children governed themselves, with the help of elder guides like Lorne. Every child was given a quill upon joining, not as a reward, but as a tool of memory. And on the day they left the caravan, they received a final scroll to carry with them. You are now a keeper of the telling. Carry it softly, speak it boldly, and listen always. In time, other kingdoms began to adopt their own versions. Caravans of students, elders, musicians, midwives, all committed to carrying memory across borders without borders. But Varellans remained the first, and perhaps the purest, because they had not started with intention. They had started with a question. Don't others need to know too? Let us now journey back to the Parliament, where all these ripples return, and where Miri's farewell marks the closing of a generation. Not with fanfare, but with a final act of grace and the soft sound of pages turning. The Parliament chamber looked different in the autumn light. Sun poured to the high, arched windows, scattering gold across the floor like spilled flour. The air smelled of parchment and apples, and outside the Capitol, the trees had already begun to shed their leaves, not in mourning, but in release. And on this particular day, the chair of the Parliament sat empty by design, because it was Mary's farewell. She did not like ceremonies, never had. She once said, "If I want to be celebrated, I'd have worn a crown instead of carrying chairs." But the others insisted, not for pomp, but for closure. So they gathered, not just the council, but the people, farmers from the valley, bakers from the alleys, historians with ink-stained hands, children from the caravan, even Tarnum's tree, the one planted in memory of the last executioner, had been adorned with letters from those who could not attend. No royal banners, just scraps of fabric tied together, each one carrying a handwritten word: memory, voice, soil, bread, kindness, truth. Mary entered without trumpet or procession. She walked with a slight stoop now, her hair fully silver, her hands lined with the weight of decades, but her eyes still held that same steady stillness, like a pond untouched by wind. She took her seat in the circle, and for a long while she said nothing. The room waited, not in impatience, but in reverence. Then she spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. "This will be the last time I speak from this seat, but it is not the last time you'll hear my voice, because you are all speaking with it now." There was a pause. Someone sniffled. A paper rustled in the back. Mary smiled. "I was not born to do this. I was born to kneel, to hush, to obey. But silence is not a permanent state. It is a place we are forced into, until we choose to leave." She looked around the chamber, not at the seats, but the faces. So many she had worked beside, some she had once feared, some who had tried to stop her, most who had simply learned, slowly, imperfectly, how to share power instead of hoard it. We did not build a perfect world, but we built one where stories are not erased, where punishment is not the first language of law, where a child's question can reshape a kingdom. And that is enough for me. Someone tried to clap. Mary gently lifted a hand, not to scold, but to soften. "No applause. That belongs to theaters. This place is for breath." And then, as if rehearsed by no one yet understood by all, the room fell utterly silent. It was not the silence of the king. It was the silence of peace. Mary then reached beneath her seat and lifted something wrapped in cloth. A candle. Simple. Beeswax. A little crooked. "This," she said, "was given to me by a girl named Lita. She lit it in the cellar, where I first read the forbidden words. It kept me company when I thought I was alone. It burned during the worst of the rain. And I kept it, not because it is sacred, but because it reminds me light does not need permission." She set it on the center table. "I will not be here when you meet again, but leave this candle where I sat. Light it only when you don't know what to do. And let it remind you, even the faintest flame can ruin a tyrant's darkness." No one spoke. No one dared. Because what more could be said? And yet, Mary was not done. She turned to the scribe at the corner, who had written every word of the meeting in longhand, and said gently, "For the record, please add this line." She left the room with the sun behind her. "That's how I'd like it remembered." The scribe nodded, eyes full, and with that Mary stood, not slowly, not weakly, but with the quiet strength of someone who had already begun walking away from history's grip. Not to escape it, but to complete it. She passed each person in the room, placing a hand on some shoulders, pausing to smile at others. A few wept openly. One child from the caravan reached up and held her hand for a moment, saying only, "We'll carry it now." Mary nodded. "Just don't rush. Truth doesn't need speed, only honesty." She left the chamber without turning back. The doors closed behind her with a sound softer than breath. In the days that followed, her chair remained empty. The candle remained unlit. And her name was never spoken in debates, not out of forgetting, but out of respect, because to speak it casually felt too much like turning memory into convenience. Instead, whenever a dilemma rose, someone would simply glance toward her chair, and if the room grew quiet and the question lingered without a clear answer, someone would whisper, "Let's ask a light." And if the candle was lit that day, it meant not that they needed her decision, but her presence, her reminder that the flame of conscience does not retire. It is passed, and passed again, until the world no longer needs candles to remember what dignity looks like. Let us now close this long, gentle history by returning once more to the people, to the village, the market, the muddy roads. In Part 20, the new silence, where quiet no longer means fear but peace, and where a kingdom once ruled by punishment learns at last to rest. They called it the new silence. Not officially. No banners were raised bearing its name. No edicts declared a holiday. It had no founder, no statue, no oath. And that was precisely the point, because the new silence was not something anyone declared. It simply arrived. It arrived like fog on a still morning, gently, without footsteps, not to blind or confuse, but to soften the edges of a kingdom that had long lived with too many sharp corners. It came years after Miri's farewell, after the children's caravan had grown into a fleet of memory keepers, after the last of the king's prisons had been turned into archives, community kitchens, and greenhouses. It came not with a rush of revolution, but the hush of resolution. The new silence was felt first in the absence of fear, in the way farmers spoke aloud in their fields without looking over their shoulders, in how bakers laughed again while kneading dough, no longer wondering if too much sweetness would be seen as subversion, in how parents read bedtime stories, real ones, without changing the endings to avoid attention. It was a silence that meant something had finally stopped breaking. The children noticed it before the adults did. They said things like, "The air feels slower," or "I can hear the bees better now." And though their words were simple, they were not wrong. Because when fear retreats, the world begins to breathe again. The Parliament did not try to control it. In fact, they passed no laws for almost 6 months, not out of laziness, but respect. They called it the listening season. "The ground is healing," one elder said. "We must let the seeds do what they were made for." And so, the kingdom listened. They listened to quiet rooms, to streams, to old women humming as they swept doorways. They listened to the spaces between words, and found that sometimes what was unsaid held more wisdom than what was shouted. In this silence, people began to choose how they remembered. Not everyone wanted to relive the reign of terror. Some buried it beneath flower beds and didn't speak of it again. Others wrote about it daily, carving memoirs into wooden tablets or painting the faces of the lost on stones beside their homes. There was no single correct way. The Parliament printed a booklet simply titled, "Ways to Remember or Not." It contained blank pages between each chapter, so people could fill them however they liked, or leave them empty if that felt truer. And for the first time in a generation, the kingdom stories did not compete. They coexisted. At the old palace, now converted into the commons of reflection, the central courtyard was redesigned as a quiet garden. No fountains, no statues, just benches, low-growing mint, and wind chimes made from pieces of old court chains. Visitors were asked not to speak inside, only to sit and feel. One man, who had been imprisoned for 12 years for refusing to salute a royal portrait, sat there every week without fail. He never spoke to anyone, never even nodded, but he once wrote on a slip of parchment, "This is the first place where I am not required to be anything. I am simply allowed." That idea, being allowed, became central to the new silence. Children were allowed to question. Elders were allowed to weep. Grievers were allowed not to move on. And the joyful were allowed not to explain why they smiled. A culture of gentle permission replaced one of violent demand. In schools, the children were taught not only history, but pauses, how to hold silence for someone else, how to sit with a story before responding, how to notice discomfort without rushing to fix it. Even in the market, a new phrase emerged. Let's give that a quiet. It was said when arguments grew hot or decisions felt rushed. It didn't mean stop. It meant let's let it settle. In time, this practice spread beyond the kingdom. Travelers brought it to cities where noise still ruled. They spoke of quiet hours, not as restrictions, but as gifts, moments where conversation could wait, and the world could unfold without human commentary. A scholar from the Northern Isles wrote, Varellin taught us that silence is not always complicity. Sometimes it is ceremony, sometimes it is healing, and sometimes it is a boundary that says, we are not ready to forget, so please hush and stay. Of course, not all was perfect. There were still tempers, injustices, debates, but even those carried a different weight now, not less passionate, but more anchored. People no longer fought to win. They spoke to be heard. And when no agreement could be found, silence was chosen, not as surrender, but as a place of return to, a shared ground where the noise could soften. In one village, a plaque was placed outside the school. In the old silence, we were not allowed to speak. In the new silence, we choose when not to. That is the difference between fear and peace. And so, the kingdom that had once punished for whispers now thrived in choosing when to be quiet. The new silence was not the erasure of pain. It was the space made sacred by surviving it. And though Miri had long since passed into the folds of memory, her candle remained in the Parliament Hall, occasionally lit, sometimes left untouched for years, but never forgotten, because that, in the end, was the truest measure of the new silence. Not that no one was speaking, but that everyone knew when they did speak, their words would not be punished, distorted, or stolen. They would simply be heard, and that, more than any throne, decree, or sword, was what made the new kingdom strong. Not silence as submission, but silence as sovereignty. Not a hush of fear, but a quiet earned and kept by all, long after the pages had been filled, after the arguments had softened into policy and the trials faded into teachings. One simple flame still remained. It burned quietly in the corner of the Parliament chamber, not every day and not on command, only when needed, only when the silence called for more than rest, when it asked for remembering. The candle, now known to many simply as Miri's flame, had outlasted seasons and scribes, debates and decrees. It had no guard, no pedestal, and no plaque, only a wooden base carved with a single word, listen. In the twilight of an early winter evening, a child named Nessa, no older than 7, entered the hall, her boots squeaking slightly on the polished stone floor. She was not there for ceremony or spectacle. Her grandmother, a once notable member of the Farmers' Accord, had brought her to visit the capital for the first time. Nessa had heard stories about the king who executed for pleasure, about the girl who spoke truth in the cellar, about the silence that broke when enough voices whispered at once. But they were only stories. In her world, the people in them were half real, half legend. She approached the candle without fear, only curiosity. Her grandmother stayed back. Some things she knew must be felt alone. Nessa stood before the flame, the golden light dancing in her eyes. She reached out, not to touch it, but to warm her fingers. Then she whispered something no one could quite hear. A moment later, a nearby scribe, an old man named Corlin who had once traveled with a caravan in his youth, stepped gently beside her. "What did you say?" he asked kindly. Nessa looked up. Her voice was quiet. "I told his secret." Corlin smiled, lowering himself to her level. "Would you like the candle to keep it safe?" She nodded. He leaned in. "That's what it does. You know, it remembers what we're not ready to tell the world yet." They sat in silence for a while. Nessa, Corlin, the candle, and all the words not yet written. Elsewhere in the kingdom, the evening went on. In villages once silence, people gathered around long tables, sharing bread and stories with no fear of listening ears. In schools, students recited the pledge of remembering, a small ritual of empathy where each child spoke not of facts, but of feelings. "Today I felt proud," or "Today I felt unsure," and always finished with, "and I know I am still allowed." At sea, A ship bearing the symbol of the children's caravan docked at a coastal village far beyond Borelon, ready to share not scrolls this time, but songs, melodies once hidden now sung, as lullabies of shared survival. And in homes lit with candles just like Miri's, families sat together, not to escape the past, but to understand it better. Because history was no longer something that belonged only to books. It lived in daily practice, in how they paused before answering, in how they forgave before forgetting, in how they honored a silence without fearing it, in Parliament. As Nessa finally stood and turned to leave, she said one last thing to Corlin. "Do you think the candle ever gets tired of holding our secrets?" He thought for a long moment, then replied, "No, because it knows one day we'll be brave enough to speak them." And so she left, her boots quieter now, her heart a little heavier but steadier too. Behind her, the candle flickered, not as a warning, but as a witness. It burned not to light a room, but to warm a memory, not to reveal what was hidden, but to keep what mattered safe. In that soft light, one truth glowed gently and endlessly. The story does not end when silence falls. The story begins again when we choose to listen, and listen they did, in fields, in courts, in cellars, in caravans, in kitchens and libraries, and beneath blankets at bedtime. The story was never finished, only passed forward, and the candle, small, steady, watchful, still burns,